In this video, we'll discuss a different type of output layer, which is going to be more efficient to use in the context of language modeling, and we will call that type of output layer a hierarchical output layer. So we've seen in a previous video how to define a neural network language model, which is essentially a neural net that takes as input all of the word representations of the words in some given conditioning context. And then we concatenate those representations and feed that to a regular neural network where at the output we get a softmax layer, which will define and give us the probability of observing each possible word in our vocabulary following our context. Now, one problem with this approach is that the softmax layer here is actually really big. If we have, say, 250,000 words in our vocabulary, then it means that this layer has 250,000 different units, one for each possible word. And when we're performing the softmax, we thus have to compute all the pre-activations, so these 250,000 pre-activations, and then we have to perform the softmax nonlinearity. So that's going to be very expensive to do if we have to do this for every training example, every example of context and the word that follows it in the text. So what we'll talk about here is a way of getting a much better, much more efficient way of defining a distribution, the distribution for the next word given the previous word, which in practice is very efficient and gives us good performance as well. So the main idea is to, instead of modeling the probability of the next word using a flat layer, we use a hierarchical layer where we'll decompose the probability of observing a word into a sequence of probabilities, which corresponds to choices as to which group does the next word is more likely to belong to. To organize these groups, we'll actually take all of the words in our vocabulary, and let's work with an example to make this more concrete. So imagine we have 8 words in our vocabulary, including the OOV word. Now what we'll do is that we'll place all of these words into a tree, for instance, a complete tree like here, which is balanced. And essentially the probability of a given word following the context is going to be given by the probability that from the root we would actually follow the path to the word cat in the tree. That is, we would go left here, right here, and then right here. So left at the node labeled 1, right at the node labeled 2, and then right at the node labeled 5. So if we model probabilities this way, we notice that we actually only need the probabilities for these 3 nodes, and we don't need the probabilities for, say, the nodes here or this node. So if we look at the probability of one specific word, then actually computing probabilities is going to be have a computational burden proportional to the depth of the word in the tree. And if we have a balanced tree, it's going to be logarithmic, so it's going to be much more efficient to compute one specific probability. So more specifically, what we'll do is that we will essentially have all of these nodes in the tree correspond to sigmoidal output units in the neural net. So we'll have connections from the hidden layer. So imagine we had this context, and then from this context, the neural net would extract the word representations, concatenate them, and compute the hidden layer of the neural net. So that's what this corresponds to here. And now this hidden layer will connect it to all of the nodes in the internal nodes in our tree, so not the leaf nodes, which are the words, but the internal nodes. Will connect them with a matrix of parameters, which I'm calling V here. And so like I said before now, say we take this example where we want the probability that cat would follow the context, which is made of the word the, dog, and the. In this case, all I need is really the probability of taking the right decision, the right branches at each of the internal nodes 1, 2, and 5. So at 1 specifically, I want the probability of branching left, and then at 2, I want the probability of branching right, and then 5, the probability of branching right. So this shouldn't be 3. This should be 5. And so now what we need is for the neural net to output us this probability, to provide us a model for these probabilities of branching. So like I said, we could use sigmoidal units, and then so essentially for this node we would take the product of the row in matrix V that corresponds to the parameters of this node here. We'll multiply that by the hidden layer, and then we'd apply the sigmoid, and then we could interpret this as the probability of, say, branching right. It could be branching left. Doesn't matter. This is an arbitrary choice as long as we're consistent with the way we interpret the probabilities. So for this example, we're assuming that taking V multiplied by the hidden layer and applying the sigmoid gives us the probability of branching right at a given node. So it means that while initially the probability of reaching cat would be to the probability of branching left, then right, then right, then if I want to use my model to validate that probability, I'll convert the probability of branching left as 1 minus the probability of branching right. And then, like I said before, I'll use my model to compute these probabilities, and they're going to be computed as the hidden layer multiplied by the associated row in my matrix of connections V. So we see here that we're taking the first row for the first node here, taking the second row for the second node here, and then the fifth row for the fifth node here in my tree. And we're doing the same thing for the biases, the first bias, second bias, fifth bias in my bias vector B. So by taking the product of all of this, then that would give me the probability of reaching cat, and I've been able to compute it in this model using only using a computation that scale not linearly in the number of words in my vocabulary, but logarithmically. And that's because I'm using a balanced tree where the depth of the tree is in the order of the logarithm of the number of words in the vocabulary. Okay, so that's the general idea for the hierarchical output layer that is very useful for in a neural network language model. So now, how do we actually define this tree, this word hierarchy that organizes the words into different leaves of a tree? The simplest thing to do probably is to just generate this tree randomly. So we'd essentially generate a complete tree. So we make it balanced so that at least the computations in the tree is logarithmic. And then we just assign the leaves of that tree randomly to different words. So we take each word and we assign it randomly to a different leaf in the tree. This is likely to be suboptimal, and for language modeling, it actually is. We get worse performance by doing this than by using a softmax layer. That being said, it's not entirely terrible. So it can still give decent results. Another approach is to actually use some linguistic resources, say a WordNet, which is essentially a data structure for words where the words are organized in some tree, and essentially the words that are semantically related share certain senses are closer in that tree. So I won't go into detail of how WordNet works. You can look at this paper for how, in particular, you can use WordNet to derive a tree for organizing all the words in into a tree. But in this paper, they actually reported really good speedups that you'd expect from using a tree. And they only saw a slight decrease in performance compared to using a softmax layer. And then finally, more recently, in this paper by Mni and Hinton, a learning approach, a machine learning approach for trying to derive what this word hierarchy should be was proposed. It was based on a recursive partitioning strategy. So the way they would actually learn the tree is that they would first learn a regular model. So if you wanted that model, if you trained it with a softmax layer, that would be slow. So perhaps you could use instead a random tree and train a first model. That model will have trained some word representations, and then we'll try to use these word representations in order to infer what the tree should be. And the way we'll do that is that we'll use some hierarchical clustering approach, where first we'd at the root node of our tree that would correspond to a cluster which contains all of the words in our vocabulary. And then I'd use the word representations and run a clustering algorithm where I would extract only two clusters. So for instance, my clustering algorithm could identify that this forms a cluster and this forms another cluster. And then I would recursively continue doing these binary clusterings, but over the partitionings that I discovered at the previous stage. So in this case, I would rerun another clustering algorithm within this cluster, and then within also this cluster separately. So maybe I'd get these two clusters here, and then here I'd get these two other clusters. And then I continue like this until in my clusters I'll only have at most 2 words. Then for a cluster that has 2 words in it, then that defines the 2 leaves for that particular part of the tree. And to extract the tree, then I just go from the general cluster. So this one here, that would be the leaf, the root of the tree. Its 2 leaves would be this cluster and this cluster. And then so for this cluster, its 2 leaves would be this cluster and this cluster. So all of the words here would be, say, on the left part of that tree corresponding to that cluster here, and these 2 words would be on the right. And then I continue like this. So this node in the tree would have one of its leaf be this node here, and then another leaf would be an internal node corresponding to that cluster, which has 2 leaves, which are these 2 words here, and so on for the other part of the tree. So we see that from this we can extract a hierarchy for the words, and then we could use that hierarchy for prediction. And so the advantage of doing this is that if we have good word representations that were pre-trained using a random tree or some other procedure, then this tree will more directly reflect the similarity between these words, putting close together in the tree words that have close word representations. And then I could retrain a new model, a new neural network language model that uses this tree now instead of, say, a random tree in order to perform neural network language modeling. So for more details, I encourage you to look at this paper, but they show that they get similar kind of speed ups you would get with other types of trees, and but without a performance decrease. So that's very encouraging. It's a very good result. And before I end, I just want to say that this hierarchical output layer is useful where, for a given context, we want to evaluate the probability of just one word or a few words. If we actually wanted the full distribution over all the words, we wouldn't gain anything because we would still need to get the probability of branching left and right for every node within the tree. And the number of nodes, the total number of internal nodes in the tree, is going to be linear in the number of words. And so we won't actually have gained anything if, for a given context, we have to compute the probability of all the words. So it's really when, for instance, we're training and we know what is the next word, then we only need to evaluate the probability of that next word. Then in this case, we get a speed up. But otherwise, if we need the full distribution, then we don't necessarily get a speed up in that case, and we'll still scale linearly in the number of words in the vocabulary. All right, so that's it about hierarchical output layer. And now most modern neural network language models use some sort of hierarchical output layer. I've described a binary layer where at every node you make a binary decision, branching left and right. You could have other versions of that where you would actually branch multi-way, not just left and right. But in general, the idea is that by doing a hierarchical approach, we can get good speed ups and be able to apply neural nets for language modeling on very large vocabularies.